Good morning, students. So far, we have discussed the concept of communication, definition, its importance, its nature, and why our communication skills are important. And today, let us discuss the concept of verbal communication. Communication can be in two types. One is verbal communication, the other one is non-verbal communication. Verbal communication means the communication which is based on the words spoken, especially which is based on spoken words, is what is called verbal communication. And sounds may not be verbal communication. So, communication can be verbal communication, non verbal communication, and paralingual communication. Verbal communication involves words, only words, words that are spoken, or a systematic organized words is what is called verbal communication. So verbal communication encompasses form of communication that involves words spoken or written or signed. And verbal communication is ability to communicate in a language that is based on the organized system of the words. And verbal communication is purely based on the systematic organized words. But whereas paralingual communication is based on the sounds and is based on the pitch, is based on the modulation, and is based on the pronunciation. So verbal communication contributes 7% of communication, whereas non-verbal communication that involves body language that contributes 55% of communication. And the rest of the percentage is contributed from the paralingual aspects of communication. And verbal communication needs a very immediate response. And verbal communication has a simultaneous approach. And if you ask a question, and immediately the responder responds. So verbal communication needs immediate reply. So verbal communication is generally used to get the clarification, and verbal communication is generally used to get the feedback, and verbal communication is generally used to have an immediate answer. And whereas paralingual aspects of communication is depends on the voice tone. Voice can be harsh and soft, and pitch can be speed and high, and modulation, based on the situation we have to change your modulation. And the paralingual aspect, we have pronunciation part also. So there are different aspects in paralingual communication. So verbal communication is purely based on the words. And I think I might have told you in my previous videos that verbal communication is not possible without non-verbal communication. Non itself is it's an anti-word, non-verbal. Whereas non-verbal communication is possible without verbal communication. This you have to understand. So non-verbal communication includes facial expressions, gestures, postures, and our eye contact, hand movements, and our head movement. So that is what is called non-verbal communication. So non-verbal communication is nothing but body language. But whereas verbal communication is purely based on the words. And verbal communication is in the form of two types. The first one is oral verbal communication. The second one is written oral communication. Oral communication. And oral verbal communication is very natural, is more natural. Here no written communication is involved in oral verbal communication. And here oral verbal communication is very much available, is immediately available. And oral verbal communication is generally used to respond to a comment or a statement or a question. When you ask somebody, how are you? the person will immediately reply, I am fine, I'm great. So this is, we can understand the verbal communication. So oral communication is in different forms. And the first form is face-to-face conversation. Second one is telephonic talks. Third one, interviews. Fourth one, presentations. Fifth one, group discussions. Sixth one, minutes of the meetings or meetings. So oral verbal communication is in different forms: conversations, telephonic talk, interviews, presentations, group discussions, and meetings. Here, face-to-face conversations. So conversation is the first form of oral verbal communication. A face-to-face communication is possible to discuss or to conversate. Conversations can be in two types: formal conversations and informal conversations. And formal conversations, when you talk to your superior, or when you talk to your teacher, or when you talk to your heads, or when you talk to authorities, when you have face-to-face communication with authorities, that is what is called formal communication. When you talk to your parents, or when you talk to your friends, when you talk to your relatives, that is informal oral communication. And in formal oral communication, you use language very carefully. You use only parliamentary language in formal communication. In informal communication, you don't need to word. You might use some. You may not be very parliamentary, or you may not be very formal in informal communication. So that's the reason why face-to-face conversations are very natural, and face-to-face communication is generally used to conversate or to get clarification, to have some fun, or to get clarification, to get immediate response, and to get an answer to the question, and to get the feedback. Generally, we use face-to-face conversation. The second form of conversation is what is called telephonic talk. Telephonic talk is another modern technology, and when Alexander Graham Bell, who is the inventor of telephone, because of him now we are able to communicate through telephones. Even the telephonic talk also comes under oral verbal communication. Here, if you want to pass some information, or if you want to give some clarification, or if you want to pass information, then you can use telephonic talk. Whereas in face-to-face communication, we have the presence of two or more than two. But whereas in telephonic talk, we do not have the presence of the people. And the caller and the receiver, they both are in different places. But they both communicate through a device called telephone or cell phone or mobile now. And they communicate through that. And most of the phone calls are formal, and very few phone calls are informal. And telephonic talk is generally used again to get clarification, to pass the information, to get feedback. And it's very much used nowadays, telephonic talk.